Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Emmy and I am an absolutely feral reader, especially for fantasy books. Now, if you've seen any of my content across YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok where I talk about fantasy books pretty much every day, you already know that this is no surprise. But if you haven't seen any of my content, you have absolutely no idea who I am, you are trying to get into fantasy books, you are a fantasy lover, or maybe you just want to dip your toe into the genre and you've clicked on this video to find out more about fantasy books and get some recs, then welcome, you are in the right place. I am going to preface this by saying that fantasy is such a wide genre. Like, there are so many subgenres in fantasy itself, and particularly the main type of fantasy books that I read are fantasy romance. But I have sort of broken down all of the genres and subgenres that, you know, I read the most and can recommend the most of, to basically help you understand fantasy a bit more and figure out what it is you like, so you know what to look for when looking for book recommendations, but also as a good place to start if you're new and you want to read fantasy and you don't know what to pick up. We're going to go through it and talk about it. I think the number one thing that people think of when they think of fantasy books is dragons. They think of dragons or fairy tales, make-believe. Some of the most popular fantasy book series ever of all time are books like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. Also, in these last couple of years, we've had authors like Sarah J. Maas who have popularized the fantasy romance genre, books like ACTA. Now, fantasy is all of that, and it's also everything in between. And fantasy literature is described as, you know, books set in a imaginary universe, typically with supernatural creatures or magical powers, but it is also so much more than that. The genres and fantasy books that we're going to be talking about today are vampires, werewolves, and dragons, fae fantasy, games and trials, gothic fantasy, dark romantasy, romance in a fantasy setting, and young adult. Now, so many of these genres and book recommendations that I'll give will sort of cross over into a few different ones. I've tried to come up with a couple book recommendations for each specific genre and also talk about what the genres are in 2 sentences or less, because this video could be hours long. I could sit and talk about fantasy books as a whole for hours and hours and hours on end, which is why I have this channel. But I think I could also do many parts and versions of, you know, this video. I could probably do one each year. So far, I picked up my first book this year in February of 2024. It's the year that I'm filming this video in. I don't know when you're watching, but this year so far, I picked up the first book of the year in, February 22nd? 2024, and today, the day of filming this, is the 4th of September 2024, and I have read 167 books, and they're all pretty much some type of fantasy book. Some of the books that I'm going to talk about and recommend I've read, you know, in the past, but most of them are from this year because that's when I really got into fantasy. Trying to narrow down book recommendations or suggestions has been hard, but also the more that I read, the more recs I'll have. So I'm not going to be able to talk on every single fantasy genre there is out there in this one video, but I can do more parts. And if you want a part 2 of this video, you know, at the end, let me know. Do check trigger warnings. Speaking on trigger warnings, especially when you come to adult fantasy and adult romantasy or adult fantasy with romance books. A lot of fantasy books deal with war and gore and murder. Always trigger warnings for books, so please look at trigger warnings before figuring out if a book is for you or not. They are there to, you know, give you the heads up before you start. I've also tried to keep YA recommendations together, and they will all be at the end of this video just because I'm gonna run through each individual genre that I have categorized these book recommendations into, and YA sort of has a bit of everything. So if you're only here for YA recommendations, you want books that are, you know, age appropriate for 11 to 13-year-olds upwards, then you can skip to this time on the screen here, because everything that I'm going to recommend before are for more mature audiences or 18+ rating. But I personally like to read a mix of both adult, new adult, young adult, fantasy, so I have recommendations for everything. So we're going to start off by quickly running through fae fantasy books. This is probably the book genre that got me into reading fantasy, the one that sort of kickstarted it all for me this year and made me realize that I love fae books. I love fairy stories. Now, when you say fairy, it's also spelled differently. It's spelled like this. I think fae is typically spelled as F-A-E, but it can also be spelled as F-E-Y. Fae is a type of fairy, but not the, you know, small little pixies with wings that we typically think of. They're mythical beings that I think originated from like European folklore, and they can look and be completely different in every single book. But I like to think of fae as just a magical being, someone who is different than a human but has a human type of form. So they look like us, but better. They're usually taller, they've got pointed ears, some can have wings, some might not have wings. They typically have some type of power. Some fae fantasy stories, the fae will have green skin and scales and tails. They usually typically have 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, otherworldly, a little bit supernatural, and probably the most popular fae fantasy. These are all basically fantasy romance books, but we have A Court of Thorns and Roses. This is by Sarah J Maas, and it is about a human. She is very poor, she lives in this town. She goes hunting to try and feed her family because otherwise they will die, and she ends up accidentally killing this wolf that turns out to be a magical wolf. You have a border that separates the human from the fae land. They can cross into it, but the fae are evil. The fae will kill you. They'll come and kidnap you and steal you. So there is this sort of alliance between the human and the fae, and they do not cross over into each other's territory. They leave each other alone, and that's it. But when our main female character kills this magical wolf, she is taken captive by a high fae lord and has to live in his realm as her punishment. This is a Beauty and the Beast reimagining or retelling. A lot of fantasy books are reimagining and retelling of a lot of popular stories. So you have, like, you know, Beauty and the Beast, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White. You have a lot of like Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet reimaginings. You have Robin Hood, Little Red Riding Hood. There are so many, but this is a sort of fairy take on Beauty and the Beast, but book 1 doesn't even like scratch the surface of what like the whole story is about. I definitely think this is hyped up for a reason. You have a big romance story in this series, but you also have this whole world building of this magical fae land and this interesting magic system. And I think it is a really good one if you're trying to get into fantasy to pick up and read, because it is quite easy to understand and follow, and I feel like each book as we go along in the series amps up a little bit, so you're not straight thrown into this like really intense world that's hard to figure out. You're sort of eased into it, and everyone, you know, knows the Beauty and the Beast story, and it's a very bingeable, addictive series. Like once you start, you don't really want to stop and put it down. We have A Court That's Cruel and Lovely. This is a sort of similar story but different. Like there are a lot of parallels with fae stories, especially with when you're getting as specific as going into subgenres. There's a lot of like similarities in books, but this is another fae story that I really enjoyed. Humans in this world have power, but the power is controlled by the king. It's taken away when you're like a child, and it's given back to you when you reach the age of 25, and no one is allowed to have power in between because it's too dangerous. Back in the old days, the fae existed, and the fae could steal the humans' powers, and some fae do exist in this world, but very few. Our human main female character ends up getting herself into a situation in her little town and ends up on the run, and she runs into a very grumpy man, and they make an unlikely alliance because she discovers that she has powers when she's not supposed to. She doesn't know why, she doesn't know how, and she also doesn't know how to control them, so she's trying to run away before she is kidnapped and killed by this king, and this man needs to get to a specific destination, and she can use her powers to help him get there, and he has already reached the age where he has been given back his powers, so he knows how to manage them and can help teach her how to use them. We have a really interesting group of characters, and again, a romantasy, so we do have a romance love story that takes place in this world. Quicksilver, I think, was one of BookTok's biggest books this year, and it is about a human thief who ends up stealing from the queen, and she gets caught. She gets herself into trouble, and while she's trying to get herself out of this situation, she ends up opening a realm between the human world and the fae world, which she didn't really think existed, but she gets herself trapped there, and she can't get out without this help of this fae stranger. She begrudgingly agrees to work with him in exchange for him helping her get back home. I personally loved the magic system in this. It was so interesting. It works with Quicksilver and metals, you know, which is where the title of the book comes from, Quicksilver, but the metals are sentient, and it's a very unique magic system in my personal opinion. Like the way that it is wielded and used, it's just so interesting. But again, we have like a really interesting cast of characters, and again, romantasy, so we have a romance plot. Avalon Towers is a little bit different. I would say this is like a silly, fun fae vibe. This is a set in a fae spy academy where an American human ends up on holiday in France and gets swept up in this fae spy mission. She's basically told by MI13 that because she's gotten involved, she now needs to work with them, and it turns out that she thought she was just like a human with no powers, but she has powers, and MI13 are going to help her learn how to train her powers and use them. The book is set between France and England because we have this evil Fae king who lives in France, and the Fae Spy Academy is set in England. This is also set more in our modern world because it's actually set in, you know, Europe. It's sort of in the future where there has been a Fae war, so there is no technology, and even though the specific location is something that's real, everything else isn't. It's, you know, all made up. Everyone in this book has different types of powers. There are Fae, there are humans, there are demi-Fae, which are half Fae, half humans, an evil king. And in this book, with the romance, we have this mentor and mentee situation. Our main female and main male character already know each other, have a very bad history, basically ex-situationships, hate each other, and now they have to work together. Book 2 is out, and book 3, I don't know when that's coming out, but I recently read book 2 and I loved the change that happened in book 2. But I think this is just like a silly, like if you want a fun little romance story with like Fae Spy Academy vibes, this is fun. And then the last book I'm going to recommend for this subgenre is Spark of the Everflame. This is one of my favourite books ever, in particular book 2 in the series. There's 3 books out, there's going to be a 4th one. We don't have a release date for it yet, but hopefully soon. In this world, there are sort of different realms ruled by the Fae. Humans are not allowed to live in all the realms. There's certain realms where they're welcomed because humans are the bottom of the food chain. Like, Fae are superior, they're elite, they have powers, and humans don't. So we already have this rift between the humans and the Fae, and they sort of hate each other for very valid reasons. But this mortal world was colonized by these gods. These gods existed back in the day and passed their magic down through their descendants, who now rule each realm. So magic is gifted from one person to the other, typically in a family bloodline, and it is passed on from the gods. So each ruler of the realm was chosen by the gods, and they rule that specific realm. Our main female character DM is a healer. Her mother was a healer and her mother goes missing, so she's in this book trying to figure out where her mum went, what happened to her, and ends up crossing paths with a Fae prince in this realm, and she hates him. She cannot stand him because she is a human and he is a Fae, and the Fae look down on them, but she has to work with him to figure out what happened to her mum. There is a growing civil war happening, and the king in this realm is on his deathbed. So our main female character DM is trying to navigate everything, but this book has like the slowest burn romance. I would say like it's a little bit spicy, but in later books. This is a heavily plot driven book, and it is very much a slow burn. So if you are looking for political fantasy, you love Fae, you love a really intricate magic system with a civil war and secrets, this is a really fun one. For vampires, werewolves, and dragons, this is one of my favorite categories, specifically dragons. I love a dragon story. Anything with dragons, I'm hooked. And one of my favorite fantasy romance book series ever is Zodiac Academy. This is a big book series. I think there's 12 books including novellas, but you also have a spin-off and a prequel series that you can read, but I'm just gonna be talking about Zodiac Academy. Again, this one is available on Kindle Unlimited as well, but it follows twins. So in the first book at least, we have dual point of view chapters, and it follows both Tori and Darcy Vega. They are humans living in the human world, and one day they sort of get kidnapped by this Fae who says, you're actually lost heirs of Solaria, and we're going to take you from this human world and bring you to the Fae world and awaken your magic, because you've turned 18 now and your magic's about to be awakened and it's not safe for you to stay here on Earth. You need to come with us. So straight from the jump you're like, oh, what is happening? And this is basically set on like a university or college campus. All the characters are 18, and when our twins arrive in Solaria, you know, you find out that there are many different types of powers, but the world is ruled based on astrological magic and elemental magic. So your astrology sign will determine your elemental magic sign. So, you know, depending on your star sign, you're either going to have earth, water, wind, or fire magic, but some people can have more than one magical power. So the twins are obviously Geminis. It's so fun. And when they get there, they find out that they're princesses and their parents were murdered when they were young. They were kidnapped and taken to live in the human world to escape, but they've come back and they want nothing to do with the politics in the world. They don't want to run a whole world and kingdom that they never knew existed. And there are 4 heirs. The original king and queen were murdered and killed, and they thought that the twins also died with them. There was a council who helped run the kingdom with the king and queen. They took over. We have a council of rulers of the second most powerful people who live in this world, and the heirs are heirs of the council. So their parents are currently running the thing, but once they've finished this university or college, they will go on and take over after their parents. So the heirs are like, we've been training for this our whole lives and you've just rocked up and you want power. And the twins are like, we want nothing to do with powers. We didn't even know we had powers 5 minutes ago. And we have enemies, proper enemies. There's clashing. Book 1 is a bully romance because, you know, we have this romantic tension of these characters who find each other attractive, but they hate each other. So the heirs are like, these girls say that they don't want to be here. So they try to prank and push these girls to drop out of the academy because they cannot claim their inheritance and take over the kingdom without finishing this university academy. The whole bullying comes from the boys being like, let's prank them, let's make their lives living here hell because we want them to drop out. If they drop out, then we can stay the heirs. And the girls are like, we are poor, we were orphaned, we have no money, and if we can claim our inheritance, we can take that money and we can go back to Earth and live our lives and be left alone. So that's where the bully romance comes in. The book 1 is quite cringy, it's very cheesy, it's quite trashy, but for me it gives like Gossip Girl vibes mixed with Teen Wolf and The Vampire Diaries. And in this we have multiple magical beings as well. So the Fae are all different things. So there's dragon shifters, there's werewolves, there's vampires. Any magical being you can think of. We even have Pegasuses in this. Like any, you know, folklore mythical creature, it exists in this world. Fae in this are ruthless. They don't care. They do not care about other people's feelings because you don't get what you want in this world by being kind and being nice and thinking of others. You got to take what you want because the Fae are merciless. They are ruthless. They are cutthroat. Another book series I love that has a prequel series is From Blood and Ash. This is definitely not a book for everyone. This is a vampire book. You don't know what's happening in this book or this series until like book 3. Book 1, we follow our main female character Poppy, and Poppy is a maiden. What is a maiden? I can't tell you, you're gonna have to read. This is definitely a book series where you find out things as the main female character finds out things. And in this whole book, she's basically finding out that what she's been trained for her entire life is not actually true, and she's trying to figure out this world and what the truth is and navigate it while also coming into herself because she realizes that what she's been pushed into she doesn't actually want. The way that this author writes her books is extremely descriptive. We will watch an action scene happen and then the next chapter is describing it in detail, even though we just read about it. Then the following chapter is like the 2 characters talking about it again. Things in this book are quite dragged out. It is heavily descriptive. The books are very slow paced and the world building in this series is insane. Like you get answers to something and then the next book it's like, oh, it's actually way more layered than that and complex. So then you're like, okay, we're digging deeper, we're going down and learning more. And then you're like, right, I wrapped my head around this thing, and then it's like, wait, actually surprise, that's not actually it. We're going down further again and finding out more. There are so many layers in this world that it's very complex. So it's definitely not for everyone, but I personally love it. Specifically though, I love it because I love the prequel series. You would think that you would read the prequel series before going into the original, but no. The best way to read these books is in tandem. I'll leave a TikTok video down below of the like reading order for this series because you basically read them in the publishing order and they are connected. So when you're reading, you're picking up like a book in this series and you're picking up a book in that series. The book ends with you talking about the characters in this one and then you pick this up and you go into it and you get the history and the background and it's so much fun. But A Shadow in the Ember, 100 times better than Blood and Ash. It is so good. And this follows 2 different characters and is set way in the past before this happens. And it's basically all the history and lore and information we get about, you know, ascensions and the maiden and the gods in this world. This is it. This is where it originated. Me personally, my brain, I'm like, yep, give me all the lore, give me all the information. In the series later on, you get werewolves and you get drakens, and drakens are a main part of this book in that they are dragons that can take a human form. And I'm obsessed with the drakens. It's amazing. And then one of the most popular fantasy romance dragon books is Fourth Wing. This is set in a war college. There are 4 different quadrants that you can enter into this war college. You can go and be a dragon rider, you can join the scribe quadrants, but this is like insane. People do die training for this. And our main female character, Violet, has believed her whole life she was going to enter the scribe quadrant. Her mum works at this war college and is like, nah, you're gonna be a dragon rider because your siblings were dragon riders and I'm a dragon rider, so you're gonna be a dragon rider. But Violet's not like everyone else. She has health conditions and she basically thinks, I'm going to die. I'm not going to make it past because it's very physically grueling, very demanding, but also not everyone bonds with a dragon because they are limited dragons. Dragons choose you, and when you are bonded with a dragon, you can speak to each other through each other's minds, but then also you have to try and not get killed. So there's so many trials and challenges and survival of the fittest, basically. But this is definitely a romantasy. This is heavy on the romance. I personally love the dragons in it, and I love getting to communicate with the dragons and all of that. For games and trials, we actually have like loads of young adult book recommendations, so I'm going to save them for the YA section. But if you think in games and trials, what is that? It's basically Hunger Games, where you have people that are forced into a sort of competition setting where it could be fight to the death, but you're competing in these trials for either survival, for a place in a kingdom. We have Trial of the Sun Queen. This is an adult fantasy romance series. This is sort of described as The Bachelor meets The Hunger Games, and I think that's a perfect way to summarize book 1. The plot develops from book 2 and 3. The 4th and final book is coming out very soon, and it is also available on Kindle Unlimited. But our main character has been living in this prison ever since she was young with her siblings. There's a lot of inequality in the world that she lives in, but for some reason she ends up escaping this prison and then is kidnapped and transported to another part of this realm out with of her kingdom. She wakes up one day, she's like, where am I and why am I here? She's told, you've been chosen, you've been selected as a competitor to enter these trials to win the king's heart. The king is looking for a queen, and it is very common that queen is chosen through these trials because some of these trials are fight to the death scenario, and it builds respect and strength and courage with the people of this kingdom if they see their queen fighting for them. Part of it is sort of a popularity contest. You have a lot of court politics, and it is a very interesting combination. I would never have thought of it for a book, but it somehow works. Then moving on to gothic fantasies. Gothic fantasies are one of my favorite type of fantasies. They're very atmospheric. For me, gothic fantasies is a time period. It's almost giving like a Victoria era. Like a lot of gothic fantasies are like Bridgerton but dark. They have elements of death and, you know, dark powers. I think it's perfect to read in like the fall time. I think one of the most popular gothic fantasies is One Dark Window. It's part of the Shepherd King duology, which is 2 books written by Rachel Gillig, and it follows our main character Elspeth, who has a monster in her head. The whole magic system of this world is sort of set up by tarot cards, and if you possess a specific card, you can possess a specific magic that's associated with it. And there are only a few decks of cards and a few of each cards available. And in this world there is sort of this plague taking over and killing people. On this hunt for these cards, Elspeth kind of gets wrapped up with our main male character, and they embark on this quest together to try and cure the town of this terrible plague that's happening. But it's very much like a darker fairy tale type of vibe, very atmospheric. I love the descriptions in this, but I think book 2 was my favorite out of like the 2 books. And then one of my other favorite gothic fantasies is Belladonna. This is a trilogy, I believe. There's 3 books out, but this follows Signa, and Signa has been able to see the dead. Signa is an orphan, and she has been through many relatives and homes of people trying to look after her throughout her life, and they all mysteriously end up dying. But just before Signa reaches the age where she doesn't need a guardian anymore, another relative dies, and she has to go and live with her only remaining relatives that are left. But when she moves in with these new relatives, she realizes there's this murder mystery that is happening, and Signa can see certain spirits. So she goes on this journey to try and figure out this murder mystery while also dealing with the courts and making her debut. There's like little romance elements, but Signa has to make a deal to work with Death, because Death himself is a reaper that Signa can communicate with, and she's got to try and work with him to figure out this murder mystery. And this is just like a really fun romantic gothic fantasy. It sounds like a lot like creepier than it actually is. I would definitely give some gothic fantasies a try, especially with the fall season coming up. I think it's the perfect time to be reading them. If you're a contemporary romance reader and you're looking for romance books that are set in a fantasy setting, or maybe you want like the romance to be the main part of the story and you're not too fussed with the fantasy elements but you want to dip your toe into it, I think interconnected fantasy romance stories are the best for this. So one of my personal favorites is Throne of the Fallen. Book 2, Throne of Secrets, is about to come out, but this is a spin-off sort of series for the Kingdom of the Wicked trilogy. You don't need to read it beforehand, you can read it alone, but it follows the 7 princes of hell. So the first one is about Envy, and Envy has to participate in this sort of magical deadly game, and he runs into our main female character Camilla, who runs this art studio, and he needs to work with her in order to win this game. If he doesn't win this game, then his realm is going to fall apart and people are dying, and it's not really good. But Camilla doesn't want to work with him because she doesn't want to get involved with like the wicked powers at play in this story. So that's sort of like one of the main plots that's going on in here, but it is heavily more focused on the 2 characters themselves. You know, I think it's really fun, really easy to read. You don't have to read anything before going in, and it does wrap up quite nicely. Like, there's going to be more books in this series, but again, they're interconnected standalones, so the story is not going to continue on in the next book. It's just going to switch to other characters that we have maybe met in book 1. And another book like that is A Deal with the Elf King. This is part of an interconnected standalone series called Married to Magic. They're sort of all set in the same world, but completely different stories and different characters. A human is chosen by the Elf King to marry and be his new queen, to sort of, you know, maintain this alliance between the humans and the elves, and this human queen is chosen through magic. Our main female character is taken away by this elf king to live in this new magical world, but it's not something she ever wanted, she never thought would happen to her. She just wants to live her life as a healer and go back to her human life, but she finds out that not everything is as it seems, and that a lot of her life was a lie. You know, she's learning all these new things about her that was hidden from her before, while also being put into this like arranged marriage with like a really cold, quiet elf king that she hates. So that's a fun one. A few of the books that I've mentioned are also categorized as like darker romantasies. The main darker romantasies that I read and loved and would recommend is the Plated Prisoner series by Raven Kennedy. This is a King Midas reimagining and retelling. So our main female character Orin was touched by King Midas and turned to gold, and she lives in his kingdom amongst everything else that he is turned to gold. She was rescued from the streets when she was younger by him. He showed her kindness, he turned her to gold, and then he took her in. So she feels like her life is owed by him, but he has full control of her. She's basically kept in this cage, and she's not allowed to speak with other people, she's not allowed to interact with them, and she lives this very isolated life. The first book reads like a novella for me, but when you first pick it up and the book starts, you see exactly why it's like a darker romantasy. Definitely check trigger warnings for this. The way that the men view females in this world is absolutely vile, and some of the scenes, especially towards the end of the book, can be very hard to read. I would say like the first book is the worst in terms of that. It does get a lot better because the plot develops and we have new characters and new settings that come in. So I feel like book 1, they really just kind of just throw everything at you to see like if it's too much for you or not. Our main female character Orin finally is kind of let out of her cage because there's this war that is coming, and she ends up having to travel to go to this new part of the world. But the journey is not smooth and things happen, things come up. Orin finds herself sort of in situations she never thought she would find herself in. Again, romantasy, so heavy on the romance. We don't really get the romance in this story until book 2 onwards. This is a very, very short book. For me, again, like this is almost like a world building novella that sets up the rest of the books. Books 2 and book 3 are some of my favorite reads of all year, and I feel like that's when the story really starts, but you need to read the first book to get a sense of the background, the world, understand how things happen. But if you read book 1 and you're like not really a fan, it does get better. That's how I view the series, but it is very much a fun, darker romantasy. The Book of Azrael. This follows our main female character Diana, and she is not like an 18-year-old human in this, you know, magical world. She is like a 1,000+ year old, very, very powerful monster. You know, similar to Faye. She was human at some point and she was transformed and given these powers, and she can do a lot with her powers, but centuries ago she basically made a deal with this monster, and now she's stuck working for him, and she develops this monstrous reputation, but it's set in a modern day world and sort of city, and everything she does is for her sister Gabby, and her sister lives more of a human life. You know, Diana tries to be this monster and do whatever Caden tells her to do to look out for her sister, so her sister can have a happy, somewhat normal life. But her enemy returns. He's been missing for many, many years in this world, and there was this war with the gods many years ago, and after it, it all ended terribly. World Ender, who was our main male character, ended up going into hiding and sort of lost all hope and isolated himself, but the people that he loves and is closest to are in trouble again, so he returns, and both him and Diana are enemies, but they have a similar end goal and they end up having to work together to get through things. So we have this unlikely alliance of these two mortal enemies who are sworn to hate each other, but they have to work together, and I love the dynamic between the two of them. I think it's so fun. We also have A Touch of Golden Madness, which is another book I read on Kindle Unlimited, and this is about a princess assassin, and she has been, you know, given the task to go and kill her enemy. In this world there are elementals and kinetics, and the elementals have elemental magical powers, the kinetics have kinetic magical powers. It's set in like a modern day America, but after this sort of war, it's very dystopian. The humans have gone underground because the two types of magical wielders have been fighting each other, and the humans have just been caught in the crossfire, and they don't want to die anymore, they're sick of it. So they go underground, and the kinetics and the elementals are still fighting each other. The princess assassin is tasked with killing her enemy, and they sort of have this cat and mouse chase of getting close to one another but not actually able to kill each other. But the princess ends up having a hit put on her and ends up having to go on the run. And definitely check the trigger warnings for this one because it can get quite dark. I cried through a fair amount of this book because it was just way more emotional than I thought it was going to be. It is so raw, but this book is the definition of literally not everything is as it seems, and the plot twists that come at the end are absolutely insane. This was such a fun, fast-paced read for me. I really got invested. It was so good. Finally, we're on to young adult. So they're all obviously young adult fantasy books, but some of them follow into some of the subgenres and categories that we've talked about already. So first off, we're starting off with Powerless. This is Games and Trials, young adult. So our main female character, Payden, is an ordinary. She possesses no powers, and in this world there are ordinaries and there are elites, and elites have magical powers and have been working to eradicate this world of ordinaries. The King's Enforcer's job is basically to kill all of the ordinaries. So Payden has been living in the slums. She pretends that she has a lower level of powers, ends up getting herself into a situation and caught up in these games and trials where she has to fight for the death, for survival. The prize is money, but everyone in this has powers, so she has to pretend not just to herself but to all the people who are watching. She's just trying to survive and get by. But in these games and trials we also have one of the princes who is also the King's Enforcer. So she gets very close to the person who's responsible for killing ordinaries. So not only is she trying to survive just making it through these games and trials without dying, she's trying not to get too close to the King's Enforcer so that he finds out that she has no powers. It is very much focusing on the main male and female character, and we have dual point of view chapters. This is one of my favorite romances ever. The romance, the banter, the tension between the two characters is amazing. You can see that I've heavily tabbed the book, and that's just everything that the main male character says that lives in my brain rent-free. So I love Powerless. Another YA games and trials book we have is Light Lark by Alex Astor. This is like a dark fairy tale. Every 100 years, the 6 rulers of the 6 realms come together to try and break this deadly curse through these games and trials that are on this land that is draining their powers. If they win, they survive, they get these unparalleled powers, but each ruler and their people are struck with this different curse, each that's specific to them and their magic. So they're all fighting because they don't want to have this curse anymore on them, but they also are fighting for more power. And our main female character is the newest leader of her realm. Leaders of the realm can live for hundreds of years, but she is not. She's new. This is her first time entering these trials with the other leaders to break the curse, whereas some of them have had multiple attempts to try and break it and haven't been successful. The last 80 pages in this book and the second book are some of the best plot twist cliffhanger endings. I think they are just so fun, and I am ridiculously obsessed with one of the main male characters in this book. I'm going to lose it when the third book in this series comes out, because right now there's only 2. There are going to be more. It is not a completed series, but I just think this is just like a fun, silly time. We have Throne of Glass by Sarah J Maas. This is one of my favorite book series ever. Again, I would say this is on the upper YA side. It can get a little bit in the later books war focused. There's a lot of war and battle scenes, but this is following our main female character who is an assassin, and she ends up in these horrible prisons but when the king is looking for a new assassin, she's pulled out to compete against others to win place as the king's assassin. So she is trying to win these games and trials for her freedom, but the actual series itself just takes off from here. Like, this single book is not what like the overall entire series is about, and I can't really say too much without like spoiling stuff, but this is one of my favorite series ever. The found family is amazing. There's a really interesting magic in this because it's not just about an assassin. In this world, like, the Fae were eradicated years ago, so it's just humans living there, but there are these magical powers and this like dark mystery subplot that's happening alongside the games and trials. So our main female character is not only like fighting for survival, but she's also trying to uncover this mystery. I will be doing a reread of this soon. Like, I think about it every single day. This book series is my Roman Empire. One of my favorite YA authors is Stephanie Garber. So we have the Caraval series, and it's about this magical carnival that happens once a year, and you have to have been invited for it. You can only attend if you have been given a special invite. We have two main female characters in this series, and they are sisters, and the sisters have always wanted to be invited to Caraval and go and participate and watch, and one year they're able to. The prize if you win Caraval is like a magical wish, and the girls have heard all these amazing stories and legends about this infamous Caraval. Once they get there, not everything is as it seems, and there's this whole mystery subplot that happens, and the magic in this is very interesting. Like, you don't really know what's real and what's not, and it even says like, remember, it's only a game, but then some of it isn't, but then it is. When you read it you understand, but it's very carnival, very magical, very enchanting. The reason that I loved this so much was because the spin-off series was even better. This is Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy, and in the later books in this trilogy you get introduced to the main character Jax, who's in this trilogy. This is like a fairy tale fantasy, but with like a darker twist. Our main female character, Evangeline, the love of her life, is going to get married to someone else that's not her, and she doesn't want that to happen. So she tries to stop that from happening by making this magical deal with the Prince of Hearts. In exchange for his help, they make this bargain, and this bargain is that he can claim 3 kisses from her whenever he wants. Not for him to use himself, but it could be for her to kiss someone else, because, you know, magical powers are at play, and it can be quite deadly and dangerous. Evangeline is quite naive and quickly realizes that making deals with immortal fates probably isn't the best idea, and our main male character is quite wicked. You know, set in a castle with a prince and a kingdom and all these different magical powers. It's very fairy tale fantasy, but in the best way. I think that they are going to be all my recommendations for this video. We're going to consider it a part 1 because there are so many other books that I could recommend, but we would still be sat here for hours. So there's some of my top to begin with. If you want a part 2 or you want some more, let me know. That is all I'm going to run through for this. I could go so much more in depth, but if you're looking for, you know, book recs, I'm always posting them on my Bookstagram and my Book Talk, so make sure you're also following me there. Let me know in the comments what's your favorite fantasy book ever, and if you guys have any good fantasy recommendations for any of these subgenres or categories, or if there's any other type of fantasy books in particular that you love, let me know in the comments, because I'm always looking for more books to read, and I might have to include some of them in a part 2. Alright, bye.